Welcome to the second to last panel today. Our first speaker is Patrick Garry, who is a professor at the University of South Dakota Knudson School of Law. Mr. Knudson was actually here this morning for the first three sessions. I should have recognized him, and I failed to do so. But he's a great benefactor in South Dakota and very supportive of the USD Law School. It's not in his bio, but Pat is also, it should be noted, a product of small town Minnesota, Fairmont, Minnesota, right on the way to the Twin Cities. I first got to know Pat back in 2014 when he was working on his History of the South Dakota Constitution, which came out from Oxford University Press. Most recently, he published a memoir titled The Power of Gratitude, which a lot of it was about growing up in small town Minnesota, where his father was the manager of the local grain elevator. Pat's most recent book is The Saga of Dakota Territory's First Railroad. So please welcome Pat Garry.
This past fall I had a writing seminar, and I had the students write an essay on the Midwest. They were all from the Midwest. And I thought that would be a good antidote to all the henceforths and wherefores and herewiths that they learned to do in law school. So in their essay on the Midwest, they consistently brought up two things. One is the landscape of the Midwest, and the other are character traits from the Midwest. And in these character traits, they talked about a belief in individual independence and dignity, but a realization that community makes us better. Hardworking individuals, but humble enough to know that we can't do it all on our own. And a belief in responsibility, but with the awareness that life is much bigger than the individual. And when I think of these traits, I think if there's one person who demonstrates these Midwestern traits, as well as who has really single-handedly enlivened Midwest studies, it's John Lauck. I think there's going to come a time when we have sessions and conferences like this where we'll devote entire sessions to the work of John Lauck. So please let's take just this brief moment and recognize our gratitude and appreciation for John's work. To shift gears, populism in South Dakota. So we use the term populism now, well, it has a particular type of definition. I think it tends to be a rather pejorative definition. We think of populism as being anti-immigrant, anti-minority. Terms we sometimes use are like poison populism. You see that in the media, violent populism. Certainly, I think there are labels and descriptions that the populists of 1900 would not recognize. When we started the session today, John talked about the Populist Convention, the National Populist Convention held in 1900 here in Sioux Falls, and I don't think those populists would recognize how we use populism today. So populism originated in the 1890s, and it became really the most important third-party movement in American history. It was an outgrowth of agrarian protest. It tried to address the economic plight of farmers who had, for really since throughout the 1880s and 1890s, had been suffering from low crop prices, from high debt, high interest rates, droughts, just about everything. They'd had a tough time of it, and they were particularly incensed about railroads. Railroads were monopolies, and railroads were charging high and discriminatory rates. Populism tended to be centered in the Midwest. I think it was most influential there, even though it also extended into the West and into the South. It had a particular presence in South Dakota. South Dakota was a leader in the populist movement. It was the first state to have a populist party. It preceded Kansas in that respect. It had prominent national leaders. Henry Laux was the leader of the Farmers Alliance, which was really the predecessor movement to populism. The Farmers Alliance focused on education, on sort of everything but politics in terms of trying to help farmers that develop cooperative movements to help them purchase their needed supplies and to market their grain. He was also instrumental in forming the Populist Party in South Dakota. James Kyle was one of the first U.S. senators from a populist party, so he joined Senator Peffer from Kansas in becoming one of the first populist senators. And then Andrew Lee here in South Dakota was a two-term governor belonging to the Populist Party. In addition, of course, as John mentioned, we had the 1900 National Populist Convention here in Sioux Falls, and South Dakota was the first state to enact initiative and referendum. That's that important direct democracy measure that populists so much advocated for. So the aims of populism I simplify into three groups. One is an opposition to industrial monopolies, particularly railroads. Monetary reform, they wanted the coinage of silver. They called this the free silver movement. They wanted that to expand the currency. You needed an expanded currency to be inflationary because they needed prices to rise. They also wanted to make it easier to pay back debt. So deflationary policies favor creditors, inflationary policies favor debtors. So they really wanted a kind of expanded type of currency system. And finally, government corruption and I'll call it democratic processes. They very much were concentrated on ending government corruption and trying to open up the democratic process. Many of these reforms that they sought would later be enacted, even if they didn't get enacted during that populist period. So there's very many, and there's different historical perspectives on populism. They range, I'll just give you a kind of a brief range here. One, of course, is the famous historian Richard Hofstadter. He looked on populists as a kind of provincial group, a rather ignorant group, one motivated by anti-Semitic attitudes, particularly towards Eastern financiers. On the other hand, there's historians like Norman Pollock who tended to look at populism as a kind of radical social and political protest movement. So looking at Hofstadter, and perhaps Hofstadter's views most mirror the views that seem to, or the image that seems to prevail today about populism. I've done a rather extensive study of the papers of Andrew Lee and James Kyle, then, those two important figures in South Dakota who have not had biographies done of them. And I thank Dan Daly, I thank Ryan Budge from the USD libraries for helping me out on that. And in looking at those papers, I don't see any evidence whatsoever of any kind of anti-Semitic attitudes at all. That's not to say they didn't have some. They probably had the same ones that the general population had, but there's no evidence whatsoever that they had any particular types of anti-Semitic attitudes. As far as their anti-immigrant approaches, they only really had one, and that is they wanted a ban on alien ownership of farmland. But that really wasn't directed against immigrants. It was really directed at trying to open up or keep open the supply of land. They also opposed ownership of farmland by corporations and ownership of farmland by railroads. So they were more concerned about not having the land being bottled up and find ways to open it up than they were about particular attitudes towards immigrants. And of course, I think also negating the Hofstadter mode is just their notions of, monetary reform. It was rather sophisticated ideas about how to reform our monetary system in ways, of course, that eventually were reformed in that way. Pollock's idea of populism as a kind of radical movement, maybe bordering on socialism, perhaps that was inspired by calls for government ownership of railroads. But it's important to note in South Dakota that they didn't advocate just all-out government ownership of railroads. They advocated enough government ownership so as to inject some competition. So it was a very monopolistic market. They suffered from the kind of discriminatory power exercised by monopolists, and they wanted government ownership just as a way to try to inject some competition into the market. There were constantly conflicts between like isolated leaders of populism and kind of the bulk of the populist membership. And many of these leaders came from previous reform movements. The leaders sometimes would be more radical than the sort of the body politic of the populist movement. But the general membership seemed to continually reject that kind of radicalism. It's the story of James Kyle is instructed. He was a Congregationalist minister from Aberdeen, and he was elected as a state senator at the very last minute as a populist, because when they heard the existing candidate give a speech, the delegates found that he was too radical for them, and so they elected James Kyle. Later on, after his re-election to the U.S. Senate, James Kyle eventually drifted away and ended up ending his relationship with the Populist Party because he thought their leadership had grown, in fact, too radical. Henry Laux, who was a major leader of populism in the Farmers Alliance, ended up disagreeing again with leaders of the populist movement and joined the Republican Party in 1898. And in addition, there were many aspects of inherent conservatism among South Dakota populists, their religious beliefs, moral beliefs, their opposition to liquor traffic, and they were committed to free market economy rather than the kind of industrial monopoly market they saw. So I would argue that the primary focus of South Dakota populism was really in terms of government corruption. Oftentimes we think their primary focus was railroads. They didn't oppose railroads per se at all. They didn't really oppose the economic power of railroads. What they opposed was the political corruption exercised by railroads, probably because of their economic power. They commonly gave out free passes, which were very valuable to legislators and government officials as a way of influencing their vote. If you look at the papers of Andrew Lee, it's filled with opposition to government corruption, and particularly corruption among the Republican Party. 90% of his substantive letters dealing with free silver, railroads, and government corruption, 90% is government corruption, 90% is opposing Republican corruption. And this, of course, is maybe natural because South Dakota spent 28 years in territorial status. Territorial status tended to enhance corruption just because you had a distant federal government then appointing as kind of patronage these territorial positions within the territory. There's a great distance between Washington, D.C. and the Dakota Territory. So by the time the 1890s comes along, really Dakotans had experienced 3 decades of corruption, and perhaps this really explains why they were so much against it. They were opposed to government corruption. One of the ways of combating that that corruption was to advocate for direct democracy, direct election of senators, which of course came to pass, and this initiative and referendum, which gave the public the ability to bypass the legislature and to enact and veto laws on their own. So in conclusion, I think in looking at populism, particularly in South Dakota, you really see it as a kind of revival of Jeffersonian democracy. Trying to achieve a democracy which is responsive to the common person, free of the distortions of special privileges granted or facilitated by government, particularly, of course, monopolies. Certainly a revival of civic virtue, We talked about that this morning in terms of, again, trying to, end the corrupting power of monopoly and to combat the occurrences of government corruption. So I think in a way the populism of the 1890s can be likened to the election of 1800, really is a return to the ideals of American founding, not like Hofstadter would say, a paranoid reaction to modern changes, or not a radical attempt to transform America, but simply kind of a return to what populists saw was the true meaning of America. And therefore, I think it's important not to let current uses of populism then, in a way, distort our understanding of the past and our understanding of what populism really was. But at the same time, I think we also have to question why it is we use the term populism in the way when it doesn't seem to coincide at all with the true meaning, the historical meaning of populism. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kevin Mason, who is a rural and environmental historian of the Midwest, and he teaches at the University of Northern Iowa. Congrats to Kevin. He has a forthcoming book entitled Retracing the Dragoon Trail in Iowa, Environmental Transformation Along the Des Moines River, which will be out from Michigan State University Press in the spring of 2026. He is also the creator of Notes on Iowa, which if you are on Twitter or Instagram, you can see every day, will pop up and give you an interesting angle on what's happening in Iowa history. He serves as the chair of the Board of Trustees for the State Historical Society of Iowa and sits on the Board of Directors for Humanities Iowa. At the University of Northern Iowa, he teaches courses on public history and American history, and prior to getting to UNI, he was a professor of history and political science at Waldorf University in Forest City. He grew up in Pella, Iowa, and earned his PhD at Iowa State University. Welcome, Kevin.
So standing here as a Midwesterner asked to explain how Midwestern history might reach the people of the Midwest and beyond feels, I gotta admit, just a little bit unnatural. Like every fiber of my heartland being and upbringing twitches just a little bit in protest because where I come from, we're kind of taught that talking about yourself is pretty much a form of poor hygiene, something best avoided in polite company such as this. And maybe that's part of the reason an entire region managed to slip quietly out of both historical study and public imagination. Perhaps we were too modest to remind anyone we mattered. For much of the 20th century, historians pointed south when they wanted moral drama and west when they wanted myth and spectacle, then occasionally gave the middle of the map a polite wave as they flew over. John Locke's tidy phrase, the lost region, summed up that neglect perfectly, and to his credit, managed to make a lot of people pretty usefully cranky. Since his 2013 book debuted, as we've been hearing pretty much all day, a quiet revival has started taking shape. A journal appeared, conferences found their way onto calendars, publishers printed enough Lauck-edited books to build a small fort. We're all running out of shelf space, John. And the founding of the Midwestern History Association offered a kind of intellectual home within the home region for many, myself included. What was once a scattered conversation has started to sound like a real field of study. The Midwest matters, even if it's often too modest to mention it. The great human dramas we often attribute to the South, the grand nation-building spectacles of the West, were just as alive here. It was in this region that the fight over enslavement in Missouri and Kansas lit the fuse of disunion, and where the dispossession of indigenous nations brought some of the harshest chapters of American carnage. This wide middle built a great deal of both the mythic and the modern nation. In factories and fields, on interstates and through ideals, the American story played out here during the nation's formative years as much as and as often as any place else. So many American images emanated from the nation's oft-overlooked center. From the Midwest came the auto line muscle of Detroit and the lunch pail line workers of 1,000 Rust Belt factories. The contentious conversants of town halls and PTA meetings debated the limits of American rights, and even the peculiar conviction emerged that you should help your neighbor shovel out his driveway, even if you can't stand the sight of him. When we stop telling the story of this place, the whole national conversation starts to drift away from a deeply rooted center. And when a story goes untold, the empty space fills fast with caricature, with stereotype, and with the voices of people who mistake modesty for emptiness. And so the question rises, who tells our story? In 2023, thanks to John again, I scraped through every course catalog at every R1 and R2 University American, found that more than 100 research universities regularly offer courses on the American South, about the same number cover the American West, and less than a single handful bother with the Midwest. Even within the region, the broad swath of students hoping to study their home, if only for a fleeting semester while pursuing a different course of study, are often forced to spend the term sojourning in the American South or West. And at many colleges, a Midwestern seminar has always proved a fragile thing. Retirements, departures, or program reshuffles often make it vanish overnight. And so a region is lost, even within its own ivy-clad walls. The pages of leading journals tell a parallel story. In the 1960s, nearly 15% of the Journal of American History's articles focused on the Midwest, a sign of how central the region once was to the nation's historical imagination. By the 1970s, that share had fallen to 7.6%, by the 1980s to 4.4%, and the decline continued, falling all the way to 2.3% during the 2010s. The current decade shows a modest rise to 2.8%. While the West followed a similar trajectory within the journal, the South rose, reaching 15% in the 1990s before settling into a steady lead over all other regions. If the numbers are depressing, they're at least illustrative in helping us understand how the academy often continues to look beyond the middle of the country, despite the best efforts of many present and even a few who unfortunately are no longer with us. Joe Amato, an unapologetic champion of Midwestern history who sadly passed away recently, was one of those rare Midwestern souls who could make a county fair sound like the center of the universe. He spent his life reminding people that local history wasn't just a hobby for retirees filling filing cabinets with clipped up newspapers, but the very heartbeat of a shared heartland. In his 2002 book, Rethinking Home, he said we ought to quote, revive those particular people, places, and past events that don't demand, but nevertheless need our careful attention. His life's work was a simple but radical proposition. History only makes sense when it can sit down at the kitchen table with the people who lived it and have a meaningful conversation. We'd be wise to heed his example, and I truly believe we're obligated to honor his memory through our work. Well, the Academy has spent decades perhaps pretending the middle of the country is a flat place to fly over, and the only conversations that matter take place through blind peer review for publications that, if we're honest, almost no one reads. Public historians and local dreamers have been quietly keeping the lights on. Into the vacuum stepped librarians, museum folks, and archivists in windowless basements, all the people who think saving an old ledger, staffing an overstuffed house museum, or interviewing a retired line worker or farmer is still worth the trouble. State historical societies, county museums, and small-town libraries pulse of the heartland's history beating, telling stories that still matter to the people who live here, and saving the scraps of community stories vital to future remembrance. Easy examples abound. In the rural community of Marshalltown, Iowa, historians, locals, and the Chamber of Commerce did something beautiful by simply taking the initiative to talk to one another. Out of that rare and becoming rarer civic experiment came Nos Vemos in Marshalltown, a project that put out a welcome mat for the many Spanish-speaking residents of the local area, while also installing interpretive panels that tell stories in multiple languages side by side. The stories highlight community members who often go unnoticed, the histories of the people who actually keep the economic of the heartbeat of the town humming in our new century. The Association of Midwest Museums has pushed for more voices, more faces, and more memories, while the Black Midwest Initiative has brought together a collective of scholars, students, and organizers to highlight the stories of people from major metropolitan centers like Detroit and Chicago, but also from smaller cities and rural areas where the lives of Black residents have too often gone unacknowledged and overlooked. The Mid-American Arts Alliance has packed up exhibitions born here and shipped them all over the nation, sending care packages from the heartland to the rest of the country. Partnerships between indigenous nations at sites like Effigy Mounds National Monument and Cahokia State Historical Site have pulled ancient Midwestern histories into global conversations about world heritage. And across the prairies and river valleys, you'll find legions of oral historians with tape recorders and archivists with overflowing accession logs, both quietly rescuing the stories otherwise unsaved. Like the revival of Midwestern history, the work is well underway. Plenty of other folks have also picked up the torch, or some of them even just turned on a ring light and started telling Midwestern stories in their own peculiar ways. It really turns out people actually like hearing about themselves, their shared past, and the places they call home, especially when it doesn't always feel like homework. Thriving social media pages and podcasts, the modern campfires where people gather, draw audiences much larger than any graduation night cornfield keg party. Take, for example, the work of Charlie Behrens. He's turned the baffling, ope-centric etiquette of the Midwest into a kind of publicly accessible performance art. People laugh, but they also nod, because they know what he says rings true. Instagram photographers make grain elevators and diner neon look like cathedrals juxtaposed against serene sunsets in a place where the sky reaches from horizon to horizon. All these folks take the ordinary and remind us that it's been extraordinary all along. Their work gets seen and heard by thousands, sometimes millions of people who, to be honest, wouldn't know an academic journal or a dissertation from a quality doorstop. And still, these people find something deeply resonant in the shared Midwestern experience. So if the public's already paying attention, maybe it's time to meet their curiosity halfway with something resembling scholarship, but reimagined for a new age. Universities can't do it all anymore, and historians can't retreat to only relying on time-tested methodologies that haven't really been relevant to anyone beyond the bounds of campus since the library digitized the card catalog. We stand before an opportunity to radically rethink the Academy's calling while reinventing the role of historian for the post-internet age in a way that enlivens and reconnects our communities. So what might this new dawn of public-partnered Midwestern history look like? To me, it looks like well-supported regional seminars at a range of colleges, but also at community centers. It looks like faculty who publish research while working with museums and libraries to translate findings for wider audiences. It looks like the rigorous research and review standards that have defined our field for decades, while also developing skills for storytelling in the digital age. It looks like projects that pair historical expertise with letting ordinary people discover their family records and contribute to accessible community archives. It looks like expert-hosted podcasts and radio series that bring scholarship to kitchen tables, coffee shops, and even back-road beat-up pickup trucks. It also looks like young people who can name local historical episodes with the same ease with which they can name TikTok dance trends. For a moment, I want you to imagine a collaborative university uniting with public history for the common good. Students interning, exhibits popping up, old folks showing up because there's free coffee and a meaningful task at hand with which to fill their twilight years. I want you to envision digital archives where ordinary people can upload their grandparents' photos and their parents' VHS tapes before the mice get to them in the attic. I want you to picture journalists and local historians getting fellowships and prizes instead of carpal tunnel, obscurity, and the scorn of the Academy. If we could do it, John, through founding a Center for Midwestern History, all the better. Not an ivory tower of a past age, but just a Midwesternly decent building with Wi-Fi that works and a coffee pot that more than likely doesn't half the time. A place that can host a visiting scholar on Monday and a fourth grade field trip on Tuesday, all while serving as a center where we could live the community values inherent in the Midwestern ideal writ large. However, good ideas, honest intentions, and heartfelt enthusiasm alone aren't going to be enough. Without infrastructure, faculty, courses, funding, institutional homes, and dare I say, governmental support, new directions may be sketched out but never leave the drawing board. Public projects may flourish for a time and then lose momentum. Bridging scholarship and public curiosity will require deliberate policies, modest investments, and a shared commitment to the work at hand. Universities, funders, museums, and community organizations can and should partner together to ensure that the region's stories are researched, preserved, and told. And all it would take in reality is a little humility, some modest investment, and the wild idea that we all have something to contribute to a regional history that belongs to each of us. The revival of the Midwestern history is already underway. Scholars have given the region renewed attention. Public historians, museums, and community groups have been tirelessly building local archives, exhibits, and storytelling platforms. Technology and social media have broadened reach in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. The Midwest is no longer lost, but it is waiting for people to notice that its quietness is not absence, but presence, that ordinary lives make extraordinary stories, and that those stories belong to everyone that lives here and everyone who cares about who we've been, who we are, and perhaps even who we can hope to be together. Thanks for listening. Let's get to work. I yield the rest of my time to the memory of Joe Amato.
Love Joe. He was a great guy. In the next issue of Middle-West Review, we have an extended obituary of Joe. You'll all enjoy reading. Our next speaker is Dedra McDonald Birzer, who is the director and editor-in-chief of the South Dakota Historical Society Press out in Pierre. By the way, speaking of Pierre, the USS Pierre was commissioned today down in Florida, in case you're interested. She is also a lecturer in history at Hillsdale College. The past 27 years, she has been a Midwesterner, although originally a Texan. She earned her PhD at the University of New Mexico, which she completed in the year 2000. She started teaching an honors course on Laura Ingalls Wilder, and it has inspired her to launch into Midwestern history with an emphasis on women's literature. She hosts a monthly virtual speaker series called History Talks for the South Dakota State Historical Society, and she serves on the executive boards of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Pageant Society and of our own journal, Middle West Review. She is currently writing an intellectual biography of Rose Wilder Lane. Please welcome Dedra.
All right, it sounds like I'm not the only person who had an assignment from our dear John Locke over here. So I think sometime last summer, John asked me to do this topic, constructing a canon, a Midwestern canon, which I, for some reason, decided was really called building a Midwestern canon. But I've been mulling it over ever since. So first, I started thinking about what's a canon. And this is what dictionary.com told me. Standard or criteria, any comprehensive list of books within a field, an established or agreed upon arguments or interpretations that form a body of information, a body of study about a particular field. Okay, are we there with Midwestern history? Maybe. I decided to put that into Google and see what happened. And so Google AI told me, which you see up on the screen, which I think it could probably say for just about any field, but okay. I will say Google AI then, after this somewhat nebulous definition, had John Locke's name everywhere, so it did know something. That was okay. And it showed us this book and lots of other books as well, so the new Oxford History. But trying to think about a canon and crafting a canon really is a daunting task, and how do I make sure I don't leave things out? So I started thinking about what I had read, and what came to my mind were a lot of pieces of juvenile literature, children's literature, that actually addressed Midwesternness. And then I also started thinking about historical events and historiographical interpretations, and I thought, can I put those two together in the same list? Well, maybe not in the same list, but in the same talk. So here I go. Okay, so there are places where there's a convergence of the canonical literature, maybe, and historiographical arguments. And so to start with that, I turned, of course, to Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in 1937, she addressed the Detroit Book Fair, speaking to an audience of fans at Hudson's department store. This was really one of her only public addresses. She just published On the Banks of Plum Creek, which is the 4th Little House book. And so she launched into family history, and then she talked about her motivations for writing. And so I know the text is little, and I'm going to read some of this. I hope you see these words here. Mother was descended from an old Scotch family and inherited the Scotch thriftiness which helped with the livelihood. Although born and raised on the frontier, she was an educated, cultured woman. She was very quiet and gentle, but proud and particular in all matters of good breeding. Father's ancestors arrived in America on the Mayflower, and he was born in New York State. But he also was raised on the frontier. He was always jolly, inclined to be reckless, and loved his violin. So Ma taught us books and trained us in our manners, while Pa taught us other things and entertained us. We had a busy, happy childhood, but of it all, Sister Mary and I loved Pa's stories best. We never forgot them, and I have always felt they were too good to be altogether lost. Children today could not have a childhood like mine in the big woods of Wisconsin, but they could learn of it and hear the stories that Pa used to tell. But I put off writing from year to year and was past 60 when I wrote my first book, The Little House in the Big Woods. When, to my surprise, the book made such a success and children from all over the U.S. wrote to me begging for more stories, I began to think what a wonderful childhood I had had, how I had seen the whole frontier, the woods, the Indian country of the Great Plains, the frontier towns, the building of railroads in wild, unsettled country, homesteading and farmers coming in to take possession. I realized that I had seen and lived it all the successive phases of the frontier, first the frontiersman, then the pioneer, then the farmers and the towns. Then I understood that in my own life I represented a whole period of American history, that the frontier was gone and agricultural settlements had taken its place when I married a farmer. I wanted the children now to understand more about the beginning of things, to know what is behind the things they see, what it is that made America as they know it. So, as I'm sure if you know anything about Turner's thesis, which we've talked about some today already, this sounds a lot like it, right? Are the echoes of Turner's speech, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Turner, like Wilder, was born in Wisconsin. Had Wilder read Turner's essay? Probably not. It's far more likely that Wilder gave a Turnerian speech without having encountered Turner, which suggests that those who lived through the frontier progression Wilder describes and gave it some thought came to recognize its historical significance. Proximity in time and space to this frontier progression is foundational to the Midwestern experience. So what Turner and Wilder both describe is the process of inscribing settlement onto this section of the North American continent that lies between the eastern seaboard and the Mountain West. This process, or at least its outlines, are repeated time and again, providing much of the Midwest with a particular history based on this process and the agrarian flavor that emerged from it. Okay, so the concepts and historiographical interpretations that I'd put into a canon both precede and follow that frontier process, which is clearly central to this canon. And I have to admit, I just kind of came up with this list based on reading, but not a very scientific or time. A process in which I put a whole lot of time. More came out of my own study, I guess I'll say. So I'd start with the middle ground that Mary talked some about earlier this morning, agricultural practices of Midwest American Indian tribes, and also culture, lifeways, histories of tribes living in the region and moving in and out of the region, Northwest Ordinance, and how that sets the roots of Midwestern order and values and ethos and emphasis on education, fair treatment of American Indians, and slavery, abolishing slavery. And then, just so many things that come out of that. And it looks like I got my pages out of order. Hang on a second here. Stuck together, okay. Process of frontier settlement. And we talk a lot in the field I was trained in, the history of the American West, about process versus place. And it seems to me that all of the process aspect of that debate happens in the Midwest. We have this idea of the West that's often discussed in arguments about the American West. It has an idea that really means something more about opportunity, and then that, to me, is the Midwest, the place of that opportunity. But opportunities for settlers often have the opposite effect for American Indians in the region. And we certainly can't ignore Indian wars, broken treaties, removal, and the stark realities of reservation life that tell us that the Northwest Ordinance provision to treat American Indians fairly was really not put into practice. We have continual migration. And those ideas from the Northwest Ordinance carried by those immigrants, especially that emphasis on education and the abolition of slavery. We have the Jeffersonian grid placed on top of old buffalo traces and Indian trails, maintaining that agrarian character of the region through the township system and platted land surveys, small towns and rural flavor, which I think is a point that Turner really missed. The quickness with which settlers pulled resources together to build schools and churches, and those schools and churches still dominate Midwestern landscapes. And I think you could still say today that nearly every Midwestern resident is related to or close friends with someone who farms or used to farm. There's a great quote from John E. Miller. He says, "The single feature of life in the Midwest that most prominently shaped its cultural outlook and its people's behavior was its agrarian character." The late 19th century trifecta of immigration, industrialization, urbanization, I think, definitely happened in the Midwest, but in very different ways from the Northeast. We can look at agricultural boom and bust periods leading to populist politics and unraveling of small towns. We want to look at the Midwest as a home front of 2 world wars that homogenized ethnic groups and gave rise to the Great Migration of Southern blacks. And we want to look at post-war realities as the Midwest is a home of a nuclear arsenal, also the loss of family farms, rise of corporate farming, new waves of immigration, all of the flyover country discussion we had this morning, out-migration, the things that our geographers are looking at today. And all of these, I think, are important points for us. Oh, and I had not moved that forward. And I want to go a little bit more into this place versus process idea. I think it's important for us to think about how the field of American West studies have been so successful and what some of the elements of that are and how we could maybe learn a little bit from that and putting together a canon. And so one of the things that I wanted to look at is historiographical developments, and perhaps putting all of those together would help us to rescue that Midwestern history and just kind of look at where it's been and where it's going. And I was so happy to hear that Michael Steiner is doing this book on just this very thing. So we can check that off the list, I think. I can't wait to see that. But what we want to be able to look at are the evolving schools of thought and the academic genealogies that go with them. Who studied with whom, and I think that's been an important element of the success of American West studies. Okay, but one of the things we really need for this field of Midwestern studies to continue is an audience. And so I suggest that we play the long game. We do that by building an interest among students from the beginning, starting in elementary school with social studies standards and reading lists for in school and outside of school. And so we have children's books that are state-oriented. There's this beautiful series of state books from Sleeping Bear Press. M is for Mitten. I think we need an M is for the Midwest or something like that version of these books. We also know that a lot of Midwestern states have recently updated social studies standards and established websites with primary documents, with material culture, also to go with those standards. And I think those standards can be looked at in terms of their importance for the Midwest as well. And that's some connections that we need to make for teachers, for K-12 teachers. All right, so I'm going to look at my second favorite area here, or favorite area that came to mind when I started thinking about this topic, are specific books in which the idea of Midwesternness is addressed. And I think that as a place where we can build an audience. So John E. Miller, again, said about these books, especially about Laura Ingalls Wilder, the land and the unique features of the Midwestern landscape, as much as anything else, are what set the Midwest apart from New England, the South, and the West, and Laura Ingalls Wilder joined her fellow Midwesterners in promoting this mindset. And so I think young readers need to be encouraged to pick up some of these books that specifically build this idea of Midwestern identity. And so here are a few of them. In addition to Laura Ingalls Wilder, we have the Betsy Tacy books by Maud Hart Lovelace that take place in a fictionalized Mankato called Deep Valley. Homer Price books, Sarah Plain and Tall, Jumping Off Place, A Long Way from Chicago, and A Year Down Yonder by Richard Peck. And then moving into high school reading and general audience, Willa Cather's books, especially My Antonia and O Pioneers, Bess Streeter Aldrich's A Lantern in Her Hand, Giants in the Earth, of course. I would say Louisa Erdrich's Birch Bark House is a really good addition to all of that as well. I'd add Langston Hughes, almost said Richard Wright. Langston Hughes is Not Without Laughter about Topeka, and a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. These are all classic tales of Midwestern life. And I think that encouraging students to read these in K-12 years fosters a natural audience for both collegiate Midwestern studies programs and a general audience for books, journals, public history about the region. If those of us who are interested in strengthening the understanding of Midwestern history in the region and the country as a whole start to cultivate an audience, we may well be able to say that the lost region has been found. Okay, now I was going to do a little story from Kearney's House Party by Maud Hart Lovelace, but you'll just have to read it yourself in the interest of time. So I'm going to close with some action items. So as I said, we can check off some of these because we've learned today of some of these things happening. But I think that Midwest Studies needs to reclaim its history from the purview of the American West as well. There's a lot of what happens in the Midwest was subsumed under the studies of the American West, and we can pull that back and build a history of the field itself. Thank you.
The last member of this panel is Dave McMahon, who was raised in Manila, Iowa, in western Iowa. He's now a professor of history at Kirkwood College in Iowa City. While researching the history of the black athlete for a chapter in the book Outside In African American History in Iowa, he met Maury White, who was a sports columnist for the Des Moines Register for many, many years, who had grown up in Manila. And Dave and Maury got to know each other very well, and that really turned him on to the story of Midwestern history. Dave was at the original meeting of the Midwestern History Association way back in 2015 and contributed to our early volume called Finding a New Midwestern History. He was educated at Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs, Northwest Missouri State University, Creighton University, and the University of Iowa. And ever since 2002, he's been teaching at Kirkwood College. Please welcome my old friend, Dave.
I don't have anything as clever as Kevin up there with that. That is great. How's everybody doing out there? You live? John's kind of a slave driver here. I'm not used to 4 o'clock, you know. Anyway, it's great to see you. You guys have all been awesome and amazing, and I can't tell you how excited I am for the state of the field. Everything I want to write about, All my neglected writing projects I can pick up now with a well-developed historiography, or more importantly, I can use all your stuff to teach. So, and I will use it, shamelessly. The title of my talk today is How Teaching Midwestern Studies Can Save Democracy. I truly believe it. Teaching about the Midwest can save our democracy, or preserve it, or pass it on, however you prefer. It sounds a little solemn and sober, but the idea, I think, is very sound. Problem is, I came up with the idea when I was with John at a bar. He was in Dyersville, watching his son play baseball in a tournament at the Field of Dreams movie site, of all places, which I think is significant. I drove up from Iowa City, where I live, to visit him. He invited me to participate. I recall getting very worked up about the subject and speaking quite eloquently, much like I was last night at the Treasury, I think, saying something about how the theory of our government and the fate of our democracy rests on informed citizenship, good teaching of Midwest history, how the Midwest is the most American region, traditionally the most literate, probably best looking, and in times of national crisis, Midwesterners have stepped to the fore. It's a point where you could applaud. Yeah. We've played a disproportionate role in saving the Union before, we can do so again, and things like that. That's the kind of stuff I was saying. I can't really remember much else, because I'm not in that state at the moment, but I do have this great photo of John and I walking out of the corn onto that famous field in Dyersville. So, lacking a memory, clear memory of that evening, I want to tell you that this is what I came up with. How can teaching Midwestern studies save democracy? We'll just go over a couple points, and then I'm going to show some slides. First of all, by facing the problems of American nationhood. At our first meeting, John, the keynote was Colin Woodard, and I met him then, and I've continued to develop a relationship with Colin. Colin has gone on from writing American Nations to a number of books, including most recently, the book coming out now is called Nations Apart, How Clashing Regional Cultures Have Shattered America. And he's now the director of the Nationhood Lab, and I'm working with him on a innovative and experimental unit of instruction that makes regionalism at the heart of the U.S. survey and more. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Number two, so face the problems of American nationhood. Number two, by providing alternative history and culture to offset what others have called, and I have called, the Southernization of America, especially the Southernization of the Midwest. Kevin was talking about the number of Southern colleges and journals and all that sort of stuff. What I'm talking about here is somewhat metaphorical, but it's really about the influence of a particular region on the rest of America. And others have written about it, and I think maybe scholars should pick up on this. It's another way of talking about everything that we've been talking about. In short, I'm saying, say no to the popping up of Confederate flags in rural Iowa. It's as someone who has studied and learned a lot about the American Civil War, it's interesting when that happens, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting. So number three, by teaching civic virtues, I think our teaching really needs to integrate the teaching of civic virtues, then maybe we'll see them more often. Courage, empathy, faith in democracy, small d, democratic leadership, and I think David Broadnax or somebody talked about love, and we need to teach those things, and there are plenty of great Midwestern examples of that. Number four, by telling stories. Stories are what connect and inspire and ennoble, and so we got to be better storytellers, and we need to tell them. Number six, in general, we need to anchor students in place. If you anchor students in place, it increases civic engagement, social trust. In post-communist countries, they look to local history to develop trust in local institutions and cities and their nations. And you know what? We should too. Local history is a kind of virtuous cycle. Teach students local history to become more engaged in their community. When you're engaged in your community, you're affecting change, or you're in what Jefferson meant by the pursuit of happiness. You have this, you're not just happy, you're contributing in a powerful way to your community. That virtuous cycle just keeps going round and round, and history is a powerful part of all that. I should say also that we should talk about agriculture. I grew up in Iowa. I'm tempted to say that I scooped you-know-what, and I detasseled corn, walk beans, but that doesn't mean I ever learned anything in school about agriculture or that much in agricultural history, sadly. And I think we need to talk about it. It's not just agriculture that's the reason for that Iowa has the highest rate of new cases of cancer, but it's definitely a contributor. So teach about it or die. Number 8, we need to embrace nostalgia. And, in so many ways, everything that Kevin has said today, I say amen, amen, amen. I almost started him in Amazing Grace because the lost region, what once was lost has now been found. And it's so great to be here at this moment. And I want to congratulate my friend John Locke for, sort of bringing us all here. It's his world, and we're just living in it. But here we are. So, in general, my perspective is shaped by the fact that I teach history at a community college, what some have called democracy's college, and I'm very proud of that title, and I like to use it a lot. It's open access, and it's rooted in the community. Community is even in the name of the college. And already it's a place, it's a kind of community center where people come and go, and our faculty, through continuing education, reach tens of thousands of people. We've gone out to Big Grove Brewery and held events, think and drinks, and we've done deliberative dialogues where we talk about difficult issues facing Midwesterners. We get people of all political persuasions together, and we talk across partisan lines, and we get the community together to start seeing each other, principally as human beings and fellow citizens. And of course, my college doesn't have an undergraduate major or graduate program in Midwestern Studies. Doesn't have an institute or center. Those things would be great. What we do have is students. Last year we had about 2,700 students in history. Not all of them took American history, but American history is our bread and butter. I teach 2 sections of US 2, 1877, and 2 sections of US history since 1870 right now. I'm going to teach one in the winter course. I'm going to teach 4 more in the spring. I'll probably teach 1 in the summer, and I teach other courses as well, if you can believe it, those of you that are teaching at universities. That's the way all universities used to be. When Arthur Schlesinger was at Iowa, he had to teach 5 courses way back in the 1920s. Anyway, over the course of my career there, I've probably taught more than 8,000 students, and I should let you know, I looked this up on the phone, so I can't say for sure it's accurate, but the current figures are something like 150,000 students in the Regents universities in Iowa and community colleges. There are more students in the community colleges than there are in the Regents universities. So this to me is a powerful audience that we should be building. And the sad fact of it is really that it may be the only history course or one of a few that they'll ever take. And in fact, with concurrent and dual enrollment, where people want their children to get their college credits before they go to college, they want that experience. Sometimes our best students might be taught off campus and never make their way into your classes or my classes some way. They've already have that credit. But nonetheless, we have that kind of a reach, and so I think we should brand those courses as courses that teach American history through the lens of Midwestern history. I don't think there's a textbook for that, so you have to write one yourself. I tell my students, I am the textbook, or we create it together. What it's about is about regional thinking, using Midwestern history and Iowa history as a way to learn national history. That's my speech. And the time I've got, if I can run this thing, I'm going to show you some slides. Anybody recognize this painting?
Spring planting.
Yes, it's great. And we could, if this were a classroom, I'd ask you to, what do you see here? Or maybe I'll just ask Kevin what this means. I don't know. But this is a picture of my backyard, actually. In reality, what's interesting is I live in the Longfellow Historical Neighborhood in Iowa City, and it's just not far from where Grant Wood lived in Iowa City. And it was a neighbor, George Devine, that is the model, apparently, in this painting. It's kind of a nostalgic painting, thinking back to about the death of his father, the war clouds of World War II. It's his last real Midwestern idol that he had created, but it really looks a lot, in some ways, like the neighborhood I live in. And in fact, I had a student who was maybe the grandson or related in some way to the person in the picture. And so think about when that stuff happens and you're teaching American history. You're not using some far-off example. You're using an example of something where their relative is the model for a Grant Wood painting. And that's kind of incredible, really. This is me. I got on the train in Marion today and made it to Manila and then up to Sioux Falls. No, unfortunately, this train doesn't exist anymore, but it once was the Midwest Hiawatha. Ran from Chicago to Omaha, but the spur is in my hometown of Manila, scenic Manila, Iowa, in western Iowa. Once a population of 1,000, probably about 750 now, but this train doesn't operate anymore, sadly. Otherwise, I would have rode it yesterday and stopped in to see my mother there in Manila, Iowa. But trains and railroads are great fonts of nostalgia and history learning. Here's the project that I've engaged in here is with Colin Woodard. You might recognize the American Nations map. So we began here with a regional focus in my American history class. We learned these regions. He's created interactive maps for us to use. And so we go right into it. Colin Woodard has argued that we look at the wrong map. The map of the 50 states won't teach us American history, and it won't help us understand why we're in the situation we're in right now. You got to learn about the regions in order to learn about our history and have a sense of how we might get to a more perfect union. In addition to that, that research has led him to lead the Nationhood Lab, which is trying to reboot a story that we can all get behind. And data journalism polling has suggested that Americans are hardwired to believe in the Declaration of Independence, thank God, and to believe in a rights-based country, and we're all in a covenant to protect those rights of one another, as opposed to heritage, blood, tradition, some other such thing. And anyway, what we do is I work with Colin to sort of create an instructional unit and also bring that out in the public and talk in those spaces like Big Grove Brewery or someplace. I talked about the Southernization of America. I think a Midwest history is an antidote to this. In the vacuum of teaching about Midwest history, in the vacuum of Midwestern culture, slips in something, and in many ways, through a lot of factors, maybe country music, Dukes of Hazzard, the Southern strategy of the Republican Party. There's a lot of factors, migration, but it's something that I think needs to be analyzed and looked at if we're really serious about Midwestern history and culture. I use sport. I've written a lot about sports. I've written exhibits. I've participated in documentary filmmaking. This is the famous drubbing of Johnny Bright in 1951. He was the leading rusher in college football at the time, and if you look at these pictures carefully, you'll see he gets his jaw broken in a game against Oklahoma A&M. I use this photo, among other things, in an instructional unit I call The Problem of the South, which shows really the difference between the Midwest at the time. One day you have all of Des Moines coming out for Johnny Bright Day, and practically on the next they go down to play Oklahoma A&M, and he gets his jaw broken, and he's pretty much done for the season. Probably would have been the first black football player to win the Heisman. He was an incredible athlete. Great story there. Also, in terms of teaching local history and teaching civic virtue, Dave McCartney, who is an archivist at the University of Iowa, now retired, really uncovered this great story of Steve Smith, who was the first person, I think, to burn his draft card on a college campus, the second person to do so after it was criminalized, but the first person on a college campus. He had started his life wanting to be an engineer in ROTC, went down to Freedom Summer 1964, got the heck beat out of him, and became kind of an activist, and in very much obscurity, apparently, taught in the 90s computer science at my institution, Kirkwood Community College. Interesting story. Who's the man pictured here? Kurt Vonnegut. Yeah, this is graces the Iowa magazine, and I show this because the Midwest has a distinctive history in terms of art and literature. I live in Iowa City. It's a UNESCO City of Literature. We talk about ourselves as the greatest small city of the arts. This is a former student of mine, Red Danielson, who painted this and got an MFA at the famed Iowa Writers Workshop, and did so without as he says in the article, ever having finished college. He's an amazing character, and it's I think Kirk would have liked it. Here's a picture of Marilyn Robinson and Barack Obama in a famous interview. She said in that interview that our democracy requires a willingness of us to think good of each other, and I think that's where we ought to be. And the fear and the rest of it, and the otherization, we need to do that Midwestern thing where we kind of start by thinking well of each other and having conversations. Nostalgia, I say embrace nostalgia. This is a former student of mine, Matthew, is in one of my classes, and you can see with the lunch pail and the garb, he does Civil War reenacting and all kinds of things. I discovered him in my class. He just got up one day and he sang these beautiful songs, Irish-American songs of the American Civil War. Sometimes historians, I think Kevin will agree with me, have created distance and alienation from their audience. There's no need for that. Nostalgia is everywhere. They're constantly writing about a surge of nostalgia, and somebody thinks it's negative, somebody thinks it's positive. There's nostalgia on the left, there's nostalgia on the right. My idea here is that, and it's not mine alone, but I've been writing about it since early 2000s, is that nostalgia can be a beginning point for critical thinking, and so we should embrace it. And speaking of nostalgia, I'm from Manila. Paul, wherever you are, was talking about sports. Nostalgia has led me to write about women's athletics in Iowa and girls basketball. And Art Cullen is, of course, from Western Iowa, too. He's become kind of the sage and speaker of Iowa. And I come from Western Iowa, and some of you may be familiar with the documentary Whiskey Cookers. And speaking of civic engagement, here's a bunch of rabble-rousers trying to save the State Historical Society building in Iowa City. Many of you have probably worked there. Recently, they achieved an injunction where I think the documents are, at the moment, not being hauled out of there. So anyway, thank you very much. I wanted to tell you the kids are all right. If you build it, they will come, you know. If you teach it, they'll come to class, okay? And again, the lost region is now found. Amazing grace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, you went over 3 minutes. Can't you see the sign? All that shot of Templeton Rye there is a reminder. We're almost done. One more panel. But anybody have any questions for our panelists? Go up to the microphone. I have one just prompted by that last slide, and this is linked to Susan Matt's talk earlier this morning. Nostalgia as a motivating force in our field, and understanding the complexity of nostalgia and how it can be useful. Does anybody dissent from that point of view about how we can use nostalgia and people's positive feelings about the region to motivate study of it? What do you think, Kevin?
I capitalize on it every day. One of the things that I run a digital project that when I talk about this stuff, it was born of I wanted to gain new skills. When I talk about learning new digital skills for the kind of new age we're in, you can make a lot of really bad videos. You can crash a lot of drones into trees. You can write stuff that won't resonate with audiences in all sorts of different ways. In the same way I think we tell our students to do those types of things and fail repeatedly and get better at them, we can do that too. So I run a project called Notes on Iowa that I started in 2021, and one of the gimmicks in that is I do 4-paragraph essays written for a general audience on things that happened in Iowa history on this day. And it's a lot of nostalgia stuff, and that's the stuff that plays. I try to work in important things that I think people should know about as well, and they do way less traffic. But I really resonate with what Dave's saying about nostalgia is a hook for people that get into it, and where it's like, I'm so tired of writing about the Iowa Hawkeyes as an Iowa State alum. But I know that's the hook that maybe gets somebody to subscribe to that page and then learn about the Underground Railroad in Iowa, or drain tile, glory be. Or any of the other kinds of things that I think are, and I think that we gotta meet people where they're at sometimes and find those opportunities. Where I also just wanna shout out that Dave and I are both products of the Iowa Community College system. and people that probably shouldn't even be sitting up here talking to you about stuff, so take what we say with a grain of salt, right?
Can I say that I use Kevin's Notes on Iowa all the time. They're great kickstarters for conversation in classes, you know. I mean, you can just link that to your course and have people learn about that. But, you know, historians have, you know, you get a good feeling about the work you do if you haven't been writing too long about it. You know, that emotion can be a beginning place for, you know, for critical thinking, and it can. And there's a thing now. I'm not keen on current culture, but is it LARPing, live action role playing, that sort of stuff? Fanboy. I think John's the biggest fanboy of Midwest history that there's ever been. You know, so you know, I mean, we start from these spaces, and then they end up in journals and so on. So I embrace nostalgia.